She was standing at the foot of my bed when she said it. Not whispering. Not even pretending to be careful. Just standing there in her good blouse and her pearl earrings, speaking in that measured, unhurried voice she used when she was absolutely certain nobody could hear her. "There's no point running more tests," Celestine said. She wouldn't want to come back to a life like this. I couldn't open my eyes. I couldn't turn my head. I couldn't do a single thing except lie there on that hospital bed and listen to my stepmother decide that my life had already cost too much to be worth saving. Welcome to Quiet Storm Stories, where the most dangerous people in your life are often the ones sitting closest to your bedside. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and stay close, because what Felicity Blackthorn survived in 5 days inside a Lake Charles hospital room is one of the most devastating and most triumphant stories we have ever told. Let's go back to the beginning. My father, Garrett Blackthorn, married Celestine Voss 11 days after my 22nd birthday. I remember thinking the timing was strange, the way you think a picture frame is slightly crooked on the wall, not wrong enough to fix, just wrong enough to notice. He'd known her 14 months. She had worked as an administrative coordinator at the same petroleum logistics firm where my father had spent 30 years building a career that smelled like crude oil and looked like a college fund and a paid-off house on the west side of Lake Charles, Louisiana. Garrett was not a flashy man. He drove the same truck for 11 years, bought his boots at the same feed store on the edge of town, and measured the quality of a person entirely by whether they showed up when they said they would. He was the kind of man who believed that people were mostly good until they proved otherwise. He extended that belief to Celestine without reservation, and she accepted it without ever telling him how far her own reservations actually ran. Garrett was 61 when he married her. Celestine was 47, twice divorced, with a daughter named Bryn who was 20 and studying cosmetology in Baton Rouge and who, at the wedding, stood beside me in a coral bridesmaid dress and said almost nothing the entire evening. Celestine was not cruel in those early years. I want to be honest about that because the story I'm about to tell you is not one I could have predicted from the woman who showed up to my father's house with a chicken casserole on moving day and helped me hang curtains in the guest room without being asked. She was practical, efficient. The kind of woman who kept a household calendar color-coded by category and remembered every doctor's appointment without being asked. When my father's health started declining 4 years into their marriage, a slow and grinding slide through high blood pressure, then a minor stroke, then the congestive heart failure that finally took him, Celestine managed every piece of it without complaint. She drove him to Baton Rouge for the specialist appointments. She filled his medication organizer every Sunday night at the kitchen table while the news played in the background. She held his hand in the hospital the last week of his life, and she cried at the funeral in a way that seemed entirely real. My father trusted her the way a man trusts a load-bearing wall. He never once thought to check whether the foundation beneath it had shifted. My father died 13 months before I ended up in that ICU. He was 68. I was 29, married to Wade, running a small interior decorating business out of a studio space I rented on Ryan Street, taking on residential clients and the occasional small commercial job, building something slow and mine and entirely my own. And before the morphine clouded his thinking in those final weeks, my father sat me down at the kitchen table and told me about the policy. It was a life insurance policy. $3.8 million. My mother, Sarah Blackthorn, had taken it out on herself when I was born, paid the premiums for 19 years before a drunk driver on the I-10 took her life when I was 21. The payout had gone to my father, who invested every dollar of it and let it sit for 8 years, untouched, growing quietly in the background of our lives like something he was tending. He restructured the policy and named me the sole beneficiary on my 25th birthday. The distribution trigger was my 31st birthday, 14 months from the day he died. He sat across from me at that kitchen table with his oxygen cannula looped behind his ears and his hands folded on the tablecloth and explained it the way he explained everything, methodically, without drama, like a man reading a blueprint out loud to someone he trusted to build it correctly. He explained the reversion clause the same way. If I died before turning 31, the policy reverted to his estate. And Celestine, per his updated will, was the sole beneficiary of that estate. He told me this not as a warning. He told me this because he believed in transparency, because he trusted Celestine, because the idea that anyone who shared his table and his name could translate that clause into motive was a thought that simply did not live inside my father's mind. It lived inside mine. But only later. Only after the machines. The last normal morning of my life was a Thursday in October. Wade had left before sunrise for a 2-week rotation on an offshore pipeline job in the Gulf. The kind of work that paid well and kept him gone in stretches and required him to leave his phone on silent for the first 48 hours of each rotation while the crew ran orientation protocols. I was standing in the kitchen in my bare feet, stirring a pot of gumbo I'd started the night before from my mother's recipe, the one written in her handwriting on an index card that had gone soft at the corners from years of handling. The smell of the roux filled the whole house, deep and dark and familiar, the way certain smells carry an entire person inside them long after the person is gone. The gumbo was for no particular reason. Some mornings you just need the smell of something your mother made to remind you that the world is still ordinary and yours. I was adjusting the seasoning when my phone rang. Celestine. She sounded warm, which I registered without examining. She said Bryn was in town for the weekend and wouldn't it be nice if I came over for dinner, just the 3 of us, something simple. I said yes. I turned the burner down to low, covered the pot and told myself I'd be back before it needed anything. I should have turned it off entirely. The drive to Celestine's house took 20 minutes. I remember the radio playing something I didn't recognize and the way the October light sat flat and gold on the surface of the Calcasieu River as I crossed the bridge. I remember thinking I should call Wade when his phone came back on, tell him about the gumbo. I remember the intersection at Common Street and a green light that was green and then not green and then nothing at all. A truck ran the red light at 40 miles an hour and hit the driver's side of my car with the kind of force that doesn't ask permission and doesn't apologize. I didn't feel the impact. I didn't hear it. One moment I was watching the light and the next moment I was somewhere dark and very far away, and the cast iron pot on my stove was still covered and still warm and still waiting for me to come home. I woke up 3 days later inside my own body with no ability to move it. The first thing I registered was the ventilator pushing air into my chest in a rhythm that had nothing to do with my own will. The second was smell, antiseptic and something floral and wrong underneath it, the kind of floral that comes from a specific brand of hand lotion I had associated with Celestine Voss for 7 years. She was in the room before I heard her voice. The third thing I registered was that I could not open my eyes, could not lift a finger, could not produce a single sound from a throat that felt packed with wet concrete. My legs were distant and cold. My mouth tasted like metal and gauze and the particular bitterness of an 4 drip in a body that has forgotten how to regulate itself. But I could hear everything. And what I heard first, before I understood where I was or how long I had been there, was my stepsister Bryn's voice, low and tight, cutting through the hum of the machines from somewhere near the window. "Mom," she said. "What happens to the money if she doesn't make it?" The room went quiet except for the ventilator and the steady beep of the heart monitor and the distant sound of a cart rolling down the hallway outside. Celestine Voss took exactly 1 breath before she answered. It was the most expensive breath she ever drew. Because I heard every word of what came next and I was going to remember every single one of them. Celestine spoke quietly, deliberately, the way she always did when she had already made up her mind and was simply informing the room of a decision that had long since been reached. She told Bryn that if I didn't survive, the insurance policy my father had built from my mother's money would revert to the estate. She told her that per Garrett's will she controlled the estate entirely. She said it without hesitation, without grief, without any of the performance she'd been delivering to the nurses and the attending physician every time they stepped into the hallway. Her voice in that room with no one watching sounded like a woman reviewing a ledger. And I was the entry she was trying to close before the quarter ended. The number Celestine quoted was not vague. She didn't say, "a lot of money," or "enough to change things." She said $3.8 million the way a banker says it, flat and precise, like a figure she had been carrying in her mouth for months, waiting for the right moment to set it down. Bryn didn't respond immediately. I heard her shift near the window, the soft scrape of her shoe on the linoleum, and then a long exhale that could have meant anything. Guilt. Relief. Calculation. I had no way to know which one, and lying there in the dark behind my own sealed eyelids, I understood that the difference mattered enormously and I had no way to determine it. What I did know was this. My stepmother had just told her daughter, 3 feet from my motionless body, that my death was worth $3.8 million to their family. She had not lowered her voice. She had not hesitated. And she had not once looked at the machines beside my bed to check whether any of the numbers had changed while she was talking. The attending physician came in at 11 that morning. I had been awake, truly conscious, for somewhere between 4 and 6 hours by then, though I had no clock and no way to measure time beyond the rhythms of the room itself. The shift change had happened once. The breakfast cart had rolled past my door. A maintenance worker had buffed the hallway floor outside with a machine that hummed in a low, grinding register and then stopped. These were the landmarks I was using to build a map of the hours because a map was the only thing I had. The doctor's name was Hargrove. I knew this because the day nurse said it when she knocked and opened the door. "Dr. Hargrove, she's been stable since early this morning." His footsteps were different from the nurse's, harder-souled, deliberate. The footsteps of a man accustomed to walking into rooms where the news was not always good and delivering it anyway. He checked the chart. I heard the clipboard, the pen, the particular rustle of pages being turned and assessed. Then Celestine's voice, appearing from the corner of the room where she had been sitting so quietly I had almost forgotten she was still there. "Doctor, I'd like to discuss the prognosis." Her voice had shifted entirely from the one she'd used with Bryn. It was softer now. Worn at the edges the way grief is supposed to sound. "I've been here every day. I'm her next of kin and I have her advance directive. I just need to understand what we're actually looking at here." Hargrove spoke carefully. He said the brain imaging showed diffuse injury consistent with the trauma, but that it was too early to draw conclusions about recovery potential. He said the body needed time. He used words like observation window and neurological baseline and cautious optimism, the careful language of a man who had been doing this long enough to know that certainty in either direction was its own kind of malpractice. Celestine listened to all of it. Then she said, "And if there's no meaningful improvement in the next 72 hours? Hargrove paused. "Then we reassess. But I want to be clear, Mrs. Voss, meaningful improvement can look very different from what families expect. It doesn't always announce itself." Celestine made a sound that in any other context would have passed for grief. "I just want what's best for her," she said. "She wouldn't want to be kept alive by machines. We've talked about it. She told me that herself. I had never told her that. I had never told anyone that. I was 29 years old and the topic of my own end-of-life wishes had not come up once in any conversation I had ever had with Celestine Voss. After Hargrove left, the room was quiet for a long time. Bryn had gone somewhere, the cafeteria or the parking lot, I wasn't sure. Celestine sat in the chair beside my bed and did not speak. I could hear her breathing, slow and even, not the breathing of someone in distress. The breathing of someone waiting. At some point she picked up her phone. I could tell by the faint tap of her nails on the screen, quick and purposeful. She made a call. She kept her voice very low, lower than she'd kept it with Bryn, low enough that I could only catch fragments. An attorney's name. Something about a filing. The phrase "before the end of the week," spoken with the same calm she'd used to describe my father's medication schedule every Sunday night for 4 years. I had been measuring my own body since I first woke up, the way you take inventory of a house after a storm, methodically, room by room, cataloging what was intact and what was gone. My hearing was sharp. My mind was clear in a way that felt almost cruel, given that the rest of me was so thoroughly immobilized. My left hand had the most sensation, a low, persistent ache that extended up through the wrist and into the forearm, but the fingers were there. I could feel the sheet beneath them. I practiced moving my index finger in the smallest possible increments, microscopic curls that I was almost certain were invisible to anyone watching. I say almost certain because certainty was a luxury I could not afford. My voice was the problem. I had tried twice to produce a sound and both times what came out was less than a whisper, a breath with no structure behind it, air escaping through a damaged instrument. Whatever the intubation had done to my throat or whatever the trauma itself had done, the pathway between intention and sound was not yet open. I could form words in my mind with perfect clarity. I could hear myself saying Wade's name, saying help me, saying I'm awake and I can hear everything, and none of it crossed the distance between my mind and my mouth. Wade was offshore. His phone was on silent for the first 48 hours of the rotation standard protocol. After that he'd have it back, but I didn't know what day it was and I didn't know what Celestine had told him or whether she had told him anything at all. These were the variables I kept arranging and rearranging in my head because arranging them was the only action available to me. Ruth Thibodeau came in at 2:15 in the afternoon. I know the time because she announced it not to me but to herself, the quiet habit of someone who logged her days in segments. 2:15, room 7, she murmured, and I heard the door swing open and then ease shut with the careful click of someone who understood that the people in these rooms were not always as absent as they appeared. She was the hospital chaplain. I learned this not from an introduction but from the way the day nurse addressed her in the hallway before she entered, the brief, familiar exchange of two people who had worked the same floor for a long time. Ruth's footsteps were unhurried, the soft, even tread of someone who had learned long ago that rushing into a room full of grief accomplished nothing. She pulled a chair close to the bed, not the vinyl chair Celestine used, but a smaller one from the corner, and she sat down without preamble. She didn't pray out loud. She didn't read scripture. She just sat there for a moment in the particular silence that some people carry with them, the kind that doesn't demand anything from the room it enters. Then she said quietly, "I'm Ruth. I come around most afternoons. You don't have to do anything. I'm just here." Her voice was low and unhurried, with the particular cadence of southern Louisiana in it, the long vowels and the soft consonants that my mother had too, a sound I associated so completely with safety that something in my chest shifted when I heard it. She sat with me for 20 minutes that first afternoon. He talked a little, not much. She mentioned the weather outside, the way the light was coming through the window at an angle that meant the afternoon was getting long. She mentioned that she had walked past a jasmine vine on the way in from the parking lot and that it had smelled the way October jasmine always did in Lake Charles, sweet and slightly too warm for the season. Small things. Real things. The kinds of details that a person offers to another person, not to a body in a bed. Before she left, she rested her hand briefly on the sheet beside mine, not on my hand, just beside it, the way you set something down near someone without imposing. Then she stood, returned the chair to the corner and walked toward the door. She paused. I heard her pause, the brief stillness of someone who has noticed something and is deciding what to do with it. She turned back. Her footsteps crossed the room again and she stood beside the bed for a moment without speaking. I could feel the weight of her attention the way you feel sunlight shift when a cloud moves across it. Then she picked up my chart from the hook at the foot of the bed and I heard her flip through it, slowly and with focus, the way someone reads something they are reading for the second time, looking for what they missed the first. She replaced it carefully. She made no sound. And when she finally walked out, her footsteps were the same as when she came in, unhurried and even, but something had changed in the quality of her silence. It was no longer the silence of someone simply present. It was the silence of someone who had just started paying very close attention. I didn't know yet what Ruth Thibodeau had noticed in that chart. I didn't know what she was going to do with it. But I had spent 29 years learning to read the difference between a person who was merely in a room and a person who was actually seeing what was in front of them. And Ruth, whoever she was and whatever she was thinking, was seeing me. In a hospital where my stepmother was actively building a case for my erasure, that was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. Ruth came back the next morning at 9:47. I knew it was her before she reached the door because of the way she walked. That unhurried, measured tread that belonged to someone who had decided a long time ago that stillness was not the same as inaction. Celestine was already in the room. She had arrived at 8 earlier than the day before, and she had been on her phone twice and spoken to the floor nurse once about something I couldn't fully track. The dynamic between the two women when Ruth entered was something I felt before I understood it. A subtle compression in the room, the way temperature drops before a storm rolls in off the Gulf. Celestine introduced herself. She didn't have to, but she did anyway, the way people do when they want to establish jurisdiction before anyone asks for their credentials. "I'm her stepmother," she said. "I've been here since the beginning. I have her advance directive." Ruth said something warm and brief, the practiced response of a woman who had navigated 1,000 family situations in hospital rooms and understood that the fastest way to diffuse territorial energy was to offer no surface for it to grip. She said she just came to sit for a few minutes if that was all right. Celestine said of course. Her voice was gracious and entirely hollow. Ruth sat in the corner chair. She didn't speak much. But I noticed, in the particular way you notice things when your entire existence has been reduced to listening, that she was not looking at the window or the floor or her hands. She was watching Celestine. Not openly. Not in a way that could be called staring. But with the quiet peripheral attention of someone cataloging details they intend to think about later when the room is empty and they have time to lay them out. Celestine left at 10:15 to take a phone call. I heard her heels diminish down the hallway and then disappear. Bryn was not there that morning. The room was just Ruth and me and the machines. Ruth waited a full 30 seconds after Celestine's footsteps faded before she moved. Then she stood, crossed to the bed, and sat in the chair Celestine used, the one positioned close enough that a whisper would carry. She did not pick up my hand. She placed 2 fingers lightly on my wrist the way a person takes a pulse, and she kept them there. "I'm going to talk," she said quietly. "You don't have to respond. But if something I say is wrong and you have any way to tell me, I'd like you to try." She paused. Her fingers stayed on my wrist. "I looked at your chart yesterday. Your brain activity readings are not what someone in a persistent vegetative state produces. I've sat with enough of those patients to know the difference. The numbers don't lie." Another pause. "The woman who was in here this morning. The one with the advance directive. Something about the way she talks about you doesn't sit right with me." I felt my pulse move under her fingers. Fast. Faster than the ventilator's rhythm. I couldn't control it. Ruth felt it. I know because her fingers stilled. She didn't gasp. She didn't call for anyone. She sat perfectly composed and continued speaking in the same low, unhurried voice. "I'm not a doctor," she said. "I'm a chaplain. I can't change your chart or override a directive. But there are things I can do that don't require a medical license." She was quiet for a moment. "Is there someone I can try to reach for you? Someone outside this room?" I concentrated everything I had into my left index finger. One deliberate curl against the sheet. It was small. It was unmistakable. Ruth's breath changed just slightly, a single controlled exhale. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay." She asked careful questions after that, the same way you'd navigate a room in the dark, slowly, one step at a time, making sure the floor was solid before putting your weight on it. He asked if I had a husband. 1 squeeze. She asked if he knew I was here. 2 squeezes. Oh. She asked if Celestine had been controlling the information. 1 squeeze. Heart. She sat with that answer for a moment before she spoke again. "Do you know where he is?" 1 squeeze. "Can you tell me somehow?" 2 squeezes. No way to tell her. No voice, no movement beyond that single finger, no mechanism for conveying the words offshore rotation or Gulf of Mexico or pipeline crew. I felt the gap between what I knew and what I could communicate like a wall I couldn't see over. Ruth thought for a moment. Then she asked, "Is his name somewhere in this hospital's records? Have you been here before?" I had. A broken wrist 4 years ago before I married Wade, when he was listed as my emergency contact on the intake form I'd filled out in the ER waiting room while a nurse's aide wrapped my arm in a temporary splint. 1 firm squeeze. "I'll look," Ruth said simply. She removed her fingers from my wrist, stood, and returned the chair to its original position beside the wall. All of it done with the precision of someone who understood that the arrangement of furniture in a room could tell a story, and she had no interest in telling the wrong one to Celestine Voss. The afternoon of day 4 was when the shape of what Celestine was building became fully clear to me. She came back at noon with Bryn and a man whose footsteps I didn't recognize, heavier than Hargrove's, slower, with the deliberate placement of someone who charged by the hour and wanted you to feel it. An attorney. I didn't know his name until Celestine used it once, Dempsey, which told me nothing beyond the fact that he existed and that she had brought him here on purpose. Dempsey spoke to Celestine in a low, professional murmur near the door. I caught fragments the way you catch radio signals on a highway, in and out depending on distance. Expedited hearing. Compassionate grounds. 72-hour window. The words assembled themselves into a structure I recognized as a timeline, and the timeline was not in my favor. Celestine was not simply waiting for the hospital's observation period to run its natural course. She was filing for a legal order to override it. She wanted the plug pulled before the end of the week, and she had hired someone to make that happen on a schedule she had apparently already worked out before she walked through the hospital doors that morning. My 31st birthday was in 4 days. I understood this now with a clarity that felt physical, a cold weight behind my sternum that the ventilator's rhythm couldn't reach. 4 days was not much time. It was enough time if someone was moving. It was nothing at all if no one outside this room knew I was awake. That night was the longest one. Celestine and Bryn left at 8. The floor settled into its nighttime rhythms, the quieter footsteps, the dimmed hallway lighting I could detect as a change in the faint warmth behind my eyelids, the night nurse's hourly rounds. I used the silence to keep working my left hand, the index finger and then the middle finger, slow deliberate movements under the sheet where no one would see them. The ache had changed from sharp to dull, which I chose to interpret as progress rather than nerve damage because the alternative was not useful to me. Thought about Wade. I thought about the specific way he answered the phone when I called, That half-distracted hey that meant he was in the middle of something but always had room for me. I thought about the last morning, the gumbo on the stove, the flat gold light on the calcasieu. I thought about my mother's handwriting on that index card, the looping letters, the way she wrote the word season with an extra flourish on the S as if the word itself deserved decoration. I thought about these things not because they comforted me but because they were the architecture of a life I intended to return to, and keeping them sharp and detailed in my mind felt like a form of resistance. Ruth came back at 7 the next morning, earlier than the day before. She came in quietly, checked that the room was empty, and pulled the corner chair directly to the bedside. Her fingers found my wrist without ceremony. I found a Wade Broussard listed as your emergency contact from a 2019 ER visit, she said. Is that him? One squeeze, immediate. He's listed with a cell number and a work contact for a company called Gulf South Pipeline. One squeeze. I'm going to call him today. During my lunch hour from my personal phone, not the hospital line. Pause. I need you to know that I don't know exactly what's happening in this room. But I know enough to know that something is wrong, and I've been doing this work long enough to trust that instinct. Her fingers pressed gently against my pulse point. You are not alone in here. I held on to those words for the rest of the morning the way you hold on to a railing on a steep staircase, not because it's comfortable but because letting go is not an option. Celestine arrived at 8:45. She brought coffee for herself and a folder of documents she set on the rolling table beside my bed with a decisive click of the clasp, the sound of a woman who had organized her paperwork and arrived prepared. She greeted the day nurse pleasantly. She asked about the overnight readings in a tone of practiced concern. And then she sat in her chair and opened the folder and began to read, and the room filled with the quiet, industrious silence of someone executing a plan they had been working on for a very long time. I lay perfectly still, kept my breathing even, kept my face empty, and I waited for Ruth Thibodeau to make a phone call that nobody in that room was supposed to know about. Ruth called Wade at 12:19 in the afternoon. I didn't know this while it was happening. I was lying in the room with Celestine 3 feet away, eating a sandwich from the cafeteria and scrolling something on her phone with the particular absorbed silence of a person who believed the hardest part of her week was already behind her. I had no way of knowing that at that exact moment 2 floors down, a hospital chaplain I had known for less than 48 hours was sitting on a plastic chair with her personal cell phone and the emergency contact number pulled from a 4-year-old ER intake form, waiting for someone to pick up on the other end of a call that was about to change everything. Wade told me later he almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar, Louisiana area code but not one he recognized, and his instinct on a long workday was to let it go to voicemail and deal with it in the evening. He answered on the 4th ring. He said it felt like the kind of call you pick up because something in you already knows you need to, the same way you wake up before your alarm on mornings that turn out to matter. Ruth told him my name first. Then the hospital. Then the words your wife has been here for 4 days. He said the floor dropped out from under him standing on that Gulf platform with the wind coming off the water and a phone pressed hard against his ear. He asked her to repeat herself. Then he asked again. The words kept arriving in the same order, which meant they were true. Celestine had called him the night I was admitted. She told him I had been in a minor accident, that I was resting comfortably, that the medical team had everything under control, and that visitors were being limited to immediate family per doctor's orders. She used the phrase immediate family in a way that placed him cleanly outside of it, and Wade, who trusted people at their word until they gave him reason not to, had accepted it. He had texted Celestine twice in the days since. She had responded both times with brief and reassuring updates that told him nothing and kept him exactly where she needed him, 40 miles offshore and uninvolved. He told me later that when Ruth finished talking, the first thing he felt was not fear. It was the particular cold clarity of a man who realizes he has been managed, and who intends to stop being managed immediately. Ruth told him the advance directive was being leveraged to push for withdrawal of life support. She told him the timeline was accelerating because someone was filing for a legal override of the hospital's standard observation protocol. She told him she had reason to believe I was more aware than my chart currently reflected. She did not tell him about the finger squeeze yet, because she was a careful woman and understood that some information lands differently in person in a room with the machines beeping and the evidence visible. What she told him clearly was this. If he wanted to see his wife, he needed to come today, not tomorrow, not when the rotation ended, today, and he needed to come to the East Wing entrance on the 3rd floor and ask for her by name, not go to the front desk where the visitor restrictions Celestine had arranged would stop him cold. Wade was on a supply boat heading back to Port of Lake Charles within the hour. He told his crew supervisor there was a family emergency, picked up his bag from the bunk, and walked off the platform without waiting for the paperwork conversation to reach its conclusion. Some men are steady in ordinary circumstances and extraordinary in a crisis. And Wade Broussard was built that way, the kind of man who moves without drama or announcement when the situation requires movement and doesn't waste a single step on explaining himself when the time for explaining can come later. Back in the room I had no knowledge of any of this. What I had was Celestine, who had finished her sandwich and returned from the hallway after a phone call with the door pulled almost shut, her voice low and clipped in the way of someone receiving a legal update they had been anticipating. I had caught the word hearing and the word Thursday and a pause long enough to tell me the information being delivered required processing. When she came back her energy had tightened, the way a deadline feels when it moves closer without warning and you realize the margin you thought you had was narrower than your calculations allowed. She stood at the foot of my bed for a moment before she sat. I felt that assessing gaze that carried nothing tender in it, nothing of the woman who had made soup for my father and helped me hang curtains on moving day. It was the gaze of someone checking the status of an asset. She sat, opened her folder and made 2 more calls before 4 o'clock. The fragments that reached me were enough to construct the picture. The expedited hearing had been confirmed for Thursday morning. Attorney Dempsey had filed the necessary paperwork with the court. The judge had a reputation for moving quickly on compassionate withdrawal petitions when the medical documentation was in order and the next of kin presented a coherent case. Thursday morning was my birthday. The policy distributed at midnight between Wednesday and Thursday. If the judge signed the order Thursday morning and the hospital complied within hours, which was standard, the sequence landed exactly where Celestine had designed it to land. The math, as I lay there running it for the 4th time, was still not complicated. Bryn arrived at 4:30. Her sandals on the linoleum were faster than usual and less certain, and when she and Celestine spoke near the door their voices had a friction between them that hadn't been audible the day before. Bryn's tone carried a resistance that Celestine was meeting with the short-clipped responses she used when managing someone's doubt rather than engaging with it honestly. I filed that friction away because everything in this room was information and I had no way to know yet which piece would matter most. Then Bryn did something I didn't expect. She came and sat on the edge of my mattress rather than in the chair by the window, a proximity that nobody else had taken since I woke up, close enough that I could feel the shift in the mattress and smell the coffee on her breath underneath the vanilla of her perfume. She didn't speak immediately. Celestine's heels clicked away down the hallway toward the nurse's station and the room went quiet. Then Bryn leaned forward and spoke in a voice so low it barely qualified as a whisper. I didn't know it was going to be like this. She stopped. Started again. When Mom first started talking about the policy months ago it sounded like planning. Like worst-case preparation. That's how she always frames things, as practicality, and I went along with it because going along with my mother has been the path of least resistance my entire life. Her voice thickened. But then you ended up here and she walked in that first morning and she was already moving, Felicity. He had the folder. She had already talked to the attorney. She didn't cry. She didn't even sit down before she was on the phone. I felt her shift on the mattress. I went home last week and I found the policy documents in the lockbox. I wasn't looking for them. But there's a date circled in red pen on the distribution page. A long pause. Your birthday. The heart monitor registered the spike before I could stop it, a sequence of faster beeps that made Bryn flinch and stand quickly from the mattress. Celestine's heels were already returning down the hall. Bryn moved to the window. When Celestine pushed open the door the room looked undisturbed. But it wasn't. Because Bryn had just given me something with more weight than anything else I had collected in 4 days of lying still and listening. Not sympathy. Evidence. A lockbox on Opelousas Street. A red circle on a page. The record of a plan that had existed long before a truck ran a red light at Common Street and long before anyone in this hospital had been asked to believe that Felicity Blackthorn would not want to come back. Wade arrived at the East Wing entrance at 6:43. Ruth met him at the stairwell door and walked him to my room herself, having identified a 12-minute window between the evening medication round and end-of-shift documentation through 2 days of quiet observation. His footsteps in the hallway were the most recognizable thing I had heard since I woke up. I knew them by weight and rhythm the way you know a voice, and I heard him slow outside my door the way a person slows when they are bracing for something they have been dreading for hours. The door opened. Ruth said quietly, "She can hear you." He crossed the room. He sat. He took my left hand in both of his palms rough and calloused and warm, and held on with a grip that was not gentle so much as absolute. I curled my fingers against his. One squeeze, the hardest one I had managed. He made a sound low in his throat and held on tighter, and outside the window the last of the October light was leaving the sky over Lake Charles. Ruth gave them a few minutes. Then she sat across from Wade and told him everything she knew piece by piece. The chart discrepancies. The finger squeeze. The expedited hearing, Dempsey, the Thursday morning deadline. The things that didn't belong in a grieving family member's behavior. The folder, the attorney, the phone calls, the complete absence of anything resembling actual grief. Wade listened without interrupting. I felt his grip tighten with each piece, not in agitation but in the way a person tightens their grip when they are building a list of what needs to happen and in what order. When Ruth finished, the room was quiet. Then Wade asked, "Who do I call?" And Ruth gave him 2 names. And a state litigation attorney. And a detective at the Calcasieu Parish Sheriff's Office she had crossed paths with once before on a different floor in a different year, who had struck her as someone who knew that the most important evidence was usually the kind nobody had thought to look for yet. Wade made the first call from the hospital parking lot at 7:41 that evening, sitting in his truck with the engine off and the windows down and the smell of the Calcasieu River carrying across the lot on a wind that had turned cool since sunset. The attorney's name was Pershing Landry, and Ruth had described him as the kind of man who had spent 30 years in Louisiana estate law and had seen enough family members try to reroute inherited money that very little surprised him anymore. Landry answered on the second ring, which Ruth had told Wade to take as a good sign. Men who answer estate calls after 7 in the evening are either very dedicated or have been waiting for exactly this kind of problem to walk through the door, and Pershing Landry, as it turned out, was both. Wade told him everything in the order Ruth had laid it out. The policy. The reversion clause. The advance directive Celestine had presented to the hospital. The expedited hearing scheduled for Thursday morning. The attorney named Dempsey. The lockbox on Opelousas Street that Bryn had described, with the distribution date circled in red on the policy document. Landry listened without interrupting, which Wade told me later was the most reassuring thing about the conversation. The quality of attention on the other end of the line, the silence of a man absorbing information rather than waiting for his turn to speak. When Wade finished, Landry said 3 things. First, the reversion clause was real and legally binding, which meant the financial motive was not speculation but documented fact. Second, a spouse had standing to challenge a healthcare directive if there was evidence the document had been obtained or used in bad faith. Third, and most critically, if Celestine had made any material misrepresentations to the hospital or to Wade himself in order to control access to the patient, that was not simply a civil matter. Wade made the second call at 8:15. Detective Reyes with the Calcasieu Parish Sheriff's Office picked up on the third ring. Ruth had described her as thorough and unimpressed by paperwork that was designed to intimidate rather than inform, which turned out to be an accurate summary. Wade identified himself, explained the situation, and read off the name Dempsey and the name of the court where the emergency hearing had been filed, which Landry had told him to obtain before the call ended. Reyes asked 4 questions, all of them precise, none of them wasted. She asked whether Wade had direct knowledge that his wife was conscious and responsive. He told her about Ruth, about the finger squeeze, about the chart discrepancies Ruth had flagged. She asked whether Celestine had made statements to Wade personally that he could now identify as false. He told her about the phone call the night I was admitted, the minor accident, the resting comfortably, the immediate family restriction. She asked whether there was physical documentation of the financial motive. He told her about the lockbox. She asked whether the person who had seen the lockbox contents was willing to provide a statement. Wade paused. That one he couldn't answer yet. He came back to my room at 8:45. Ruth was still there, which I had not expected. She had told the charge nurse she was staying late for a patient in distress in a room down the hall, which was technically not a lie, depending on how broadly you define distress. Wade sat beside me and held my hand again and spoke in a low voice that he kept carefully steady. He told me what Landry had said. He told me what Reyes had said. He told me the piece that was still missing. Bryn. Without a statement from Bryn confirming what she had seen in that lockbox, the The red circle on the distribution page was a story rather than evidence. Landry could work with the financial documents themselves once they were subpoenaed, but that process took time they might not have before Thursday morning. A voluntary statement from Bryn given before the hearing could change the timeline entirely. I squeezed his hand once. He understood it as agreement. Then he asked the harder question. Do you think she'll do it? I held still for a moment. Then I squeezed twice. I didn't know. And not knowing was the most honest answer I had. Ruth left at 9. She told Wade to get some rest, which he didn't do, and told him she would be back at 7 the next morning. Before she walked out, she stopped at the foot of my bed and stood there for a moment in the way she had that very first afternoon, that quality of attention that felt like being seen rather than assessed. She didn't say anything. She just nodded once, the nod of someone confirming a decision they had already made privately, and then her footsteps carried her out into the hallway and the door eased shut behind her. Wade stayed until midnight. He sat in the chair beside me and talked sometimes and was quiet other times, and the talking was the ordinary kind, the kind that has nothing to do with the situation and everything to do with the person. He told me about a sandbar that had appeared on the eastern bend of the Calcasieu over the summer, wide enough to stand on at low tide, which his crew had started calling a landmark even though it would probably be gone by spring. He told me the neighbor's dog had gotten into the backyard again and eaten 3 tomatoes directly off the vine, which he had discovered when he got home to pack his bag for the rotation and found the evidence in the dirt. He told me the gumbo on the stove was still there when he got home, covered the burner off exactly as I had left it. He said the whole kitchen smelled like my mother and he had stood at the stove for a full minute before he could make himself move. I lay still and listened and held his hand and understood that he was doing what he always did in a crisis, which was to keep talking about real things, ordinary things, the sandbar and the dog and the gumbo, because the real and ordinary things were the proof that the life we had built was still there waiting, and talking about it was a way of holding the door open. He left at midnight. He pressed his lips to my forehead and told me Landry was filing an emergency motion first thing in the morning to challenge the Thursday hearing on grounds of spousal standing and contested directive validity. He told me Reyes was pulling Celestine's phone records and had already requested the advance directive documents from the hospital's legal department for review. He told me that whatever happened tomorrow, he was not going to let Thursday morning arrive without a fight. Then he was gone and the room settled back into its nighttime quiet and I was alone with the machines in the dark in the hours between now and morning. Celestine arrived at 7:58. She was dressed more carefully than any previous morning, the kind of care that signals a day you have been preparing for, and she carried the folder with the same decisive grip she always used, but there was something different underneath the composure. A tautness around the edges of her movements, in the way she set the folder down and in the way she checked her phone twice in the first 3 minutes, that told me the morning was not unfolding exactly as she had planned it. She took a phone call at 8:15 in the hallway. I heard the door pull almost closed. I heard the controlled quality of her voice managing something she had not anticipated. When she came back into the room, she sat down without opening the folder. Bryn arrived at 8:30. The friction between them from the day before had not resolved. I heard it immediately in the silence after Bryn sat down, the specific silence of two people who have had a conversation that ended badly and have not yet decided what to do about it. Celestine spoke first. She said the hearing was still on for Thursday morning and that Dempsey was confident. She said by Thursday afternoon everything would be settled. Her voice when she said it had the quality of a statement made to convince someone who was not yet convinced. Bryn didn't respond immediately. I heard her thumbnail trace the edge of her phone case, the small repetitive sound she made when she was thinking through something she had been turning over for a long time. Then she stood up. I heard the chair legs scrape. She said she needed some air and she was going to walk to the end of the hall. Her footsteps moved to the door. And then she stopped. Mom. Her voice was quiet and entirely flat. I called Dad last night. My actual father. I told him what was happening. Celestine said nothing. He told me I need to talk to a lawyer before I go any further with this. His lawyer. He's already made the call. Still nothing from Celestine. I can't give a statement against you. But I'm not giving one for you either. I'm not signing anything. I'm not going to the courthouse. Pause. The longest one in the room since I woke up. I'm sorry, Mom. I can't. Her footsteps moved through the door and down the hallway and didn't come back. The room was so quiet after that I could hear the hum of the ventilator more clearly than I had in days, steady and mechanical and indifferent to everything that had just happened. Celestine sat perfectly still. I felt her stillness the way you feel a storm that has gone quiet in the middle, the brief strange calm that means the second half is still coming. She picked up her phone. Her voice when she spoke was lower than I had ever heard it and completely controlled. "Dempsey," she said. "We may have a problem." She had no idea how large the problem actually was. Neither did I, not yet. But somewhere across town in a Calcasieu Parish Sheriff's Office, Detective Reyes had just received the hospital's advance directive documents by fax and was sitting at her desk comparing two versions of a 4-page legal instrument, looking for a discrepancy that Celestine Voss had spent a very long time hoping nobody would ever think to look for. The original advance directive my father's attorney had filed on my behalf was 3 pages long. The version Celestine had given the hospital was 4. Detective Reyes identified the discrepancy Wednesday morning by requesting both documents simultaneously and placing them side by side on her desk. The first 3 pages were identical. The 4th was not in the original. It had been added, and it contained a clause specifically authorizing the healthcare agent to direct withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment in the event of a persistent vegetative state diagnosis. My signature appeared at the bottom. It shared every visual characteristic with the one on the original document. The slight leftward lean, the compressed middle letters, the trailing final stroke. It was not my signature in the sense that I had never held a pen over that page in my life. Reyes called the estate attorney at 10:15. He confirmed the original document contained no such clause and had never been amended. She contacted a forensic document examiner named Cortez, a retired federal analyst in Baton Rouge who agreed to a priority review. He called back at 11:50. The signature on page 4 showed uniform ink density consistent with digital reproduction rather than pen pressure. Under magnification, the ink lines lacked the natural feathering that occurs when a pen meets paper. The signature had been lifted from the original, digitally isolated, and placed on the fabricated page. A forgery in his professional assessment. Careful enough to pass hospital admissions intake. Not careful enough to survive forensic examination. Reyes called Wade at 12:30. The forgery elevated the matter from civil dispute to criminal, specifically fraud and conspiracy to commit homicide. She was applying for an arrest warrant and a motion to stay the Thursday hearing on grounds of fraudulent documentation. Wade called Landry immediately. Landry had already spoken with the presiding judge's clerk that morning, and when he called back with Reyes's forensic findings, the clerk put him on hold for 4 minutes and returned to confirm the hearing had been postponed pending investigation. Dempsey, when notified, said he needed to speak with his client before making further filings. That was the last time Dempsey spoke on Celestine Voss's behalf in this matter. I knew none of this while it was happening. What I knew, lying in that room on Wednesday afternoon, was that Celestine had grown very still and very focused in a way that felt different from her previous stillness. The waiting quality was gone. What had replaced it was the focused, contained quality of a person running out of options and examining each remaining one with the precision of someone who understood that the margin for error had become extremely small. She made 3 calls between noon and 2 o'clock, all of them in the hallway, all of them brief, and when she came back from the third one she stood at the foot of my bed for a long moment and said nothing, and the silence had a different weight than any silence that had come before it. Then she said in a voice so quiet it was almost not there, "I did everything for that man. 12 years. Everything." She wasn't speaking to me. She was speaking to the room, to herself, to some version of the argument she had been running inside her own head since my father's will was read, and she understood what it contained. "He left you everything that mattered. Everything that was your mother's. And he left me a house with a mortgage." She paused. "I'm not a villain. I'm just a woman who ran out of patience." I lay perfectly still. Kept my breathing even. I thought about my father at the kitchen table with his oxygen cannula and his folded hands and his absolute certainty that the woman who had managed his medications and held his hand in the hospital would never look at the money his first wife left behind and see something that belonged to her. I thought about how much he had loved Celestine and how entirely he had been wrong about what she would do with that love when the circumstances shifted. Ruth arrived at 2:30. She came into the room and assessed it in the quick, practiced way she assessed every room she entered. And something in what she saw made her cross directly to the bed rather than the corner chair. She placed her fingers on my wrist. Wade is outside, she said quietly. He's been in the parking lot since noon. He didn't want to come up before the hall cleared. One squeeze. The hearing has been postponed. One squeeze harder. Reyes is on her way. I felt something move through my chest that was not quite relief and not quite anything else I had a word for. The feeling of a door that had been locked from the outside for 5 days finally turning on its hinges. Ruth stayed beside me. Celestine was in the chair by the window, phone in hand, waiting for a call back that I suspected was not going to bring her the news she needed. At 3:15 I heard new footsteps in the hallway, multiple sets, moving with the coordinated purpose that has nothing in common with the hospital's ordinary rhythms. A knock on the door, brief and professional. It opened before Celestine had a chance to respond. Detective Reyes was 44 years old, compact, with short dark hair and the kind of stillness that comes from years of walking into rooms where the situation was already volatile and had to be kept from becoming worse. She had 2 uniformed officers with her. She looked at Celestine directly and said her name as a statement rather than a question, the way you identify something you have already confirmed. Celestine stood. Her folder was on the rolling table beside my bed. Her phone was in her hand. She looked at Reyes and then at the officers, and then for the first time since I had woken up in this room she looked directly at me. I opened my eyes. The light came at me in a white flood, fluorescent and disorienting, and I blinked through it until the shapes resolved. The ceiling. The monitors. The window with the October afternoon light pressing against the curtains. Reyes and the 2 officers near the door. Ruth beside my bed with her fingers still on my wrist. And Celestine standing at the foot of my bed with her folder in one hand and her phone in the other, and her face doing something I had never seen it do before, not grief, not anger, but the specific expression of a person who has planned for every contingency except the one currently unfolding in front of them. I looked at her. I did not look away. Reyes said something behind her and Celestine turned, and one of the officers stepped forward, and I heard the words clearly in the quiet of the room, measured and official and arriving in exactly the order they were supposed to. Celestine Voss, you are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy and attempted homicide. You have the right to remain silent. She had the right to remain silent. She chose not to exercise it. She said in the voice she used when she was telling a doctor what she wanted, "This is a misunderstanding. I was acting in her best interests." Reyes looked at her with the expression of someone who has heard that sentence more times than she can count and is no longer interested in its variations. "Ma'am," she said, "we'll sort that out downtown." Wade was in the doorway before the officers reached the hall. He had come up the east stairwell and been waiting outside the room, and I heard him step back to let the officers pass, and then his footsteps crossed the floor and he was beside me and his hand was around mine, and I managed the thing I had been trying to manage for 5 days. I opened my mouth. My throat was raw and the words came out barely above a whisper, cracked at the edges, nothing like my normal voice. But they were words. Real ones. Shaped and intentional and entirely mine. "I'm here," I said. Wade put his forehead against my hand and said nothing for a long time, and the silence was the best kind, the kind with nothing in it that needed to be fixed. Ruth stood at the door. She was watching the hallway where the officers had gone with the same expression she had used on my chart 4 days ago. The expression of someone who has identified something important and is making sure it goes where it is supposed to go. Then she turned back to the room, looked at me and did what she always did. She nodded once, practical and warm and entirely Ruth, and said, "There she is." Pershing Landry arrived at 4 o'clock with a leather briefcase and the unhurried manner of a man who had been doing this long enough to know that the paperwork could wait 15 minutes while the people in the room had a moment to breathe. He sat across from Wade and me and explained what came next with the same directness my father had used at that kitchen table. The forgery invalidated the advance directive entirely. Celestine's criminal charges would trigger what Louisiana law called a predatory beneficiary provision, which meant she could not benefit from any estate to which her actions had contributed harm. The policy, as of midnight between Wednesday and Thursday, had distributed to its named beneficiary without interruption or contest. $3.8 million. My mother's money. Exactly where my father had always intended it to go. I looked at the window. The October light was still there, lower now, angled, the particular gold of a Louisiana afternoon that is almost evening. Somewhere across town a lockbox sat on a shelf on Opelousas Street with a red circle on a page, now in evidence. Somewhere down the hall Ruth Thibodeau was making her afternoon rounds with her unhurried footsteps and her particular quality of attention that had started all of this. And on my kitchen stove 40 minutes across the city, a cast iron pot sat covered and waiting, and my mother's handwriting was on an index card on the counter beside it, the word season with its extra flourish on the S, and the gumbo inside had been cold for 5 days but the recipe was not going anywhere. Neither was I. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confire Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.